My name is Bhushan Sethi. I'm a partner at PwC in the US. I'm also an adjunct professor at NYU Stern. I'm going to provide a brief introduction, and then I'll have my panelists introduce themselves, and we'll get into the discussion. So I'm a consultant around AI transformation. I help companies implement AI, drive the return on investment in a responsible way with AI. What's really important about this discussion is we need to demystify what we mean by standard setting. There's been a whole lot of discussion at this week's summit around the importance of global cooperation, the importance of inclusion around AI, driving solutions that meet everybody's needs. The tech CEOs spoke about it yesterday. World leaders have spoken about it. We're here in India where it's about planet and people and prosperity. So that's what the discussion is going to be about, and we are going to have time for Q&A at the end. But I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves first, in the order that they're sitting, to introduce themselves and also talk about what standards mean for them, what lens they're looking at from a standards perspective around AI. And we're going to get the mics to work.
Hello. My name is Rebecca Weiss. I'm the Executive Director of ML Commons. We are an AI benchmarking organization. We are an engineering consortium that focuses on that problem. And so for us as a technical standards organization around benchmarking, what that means for us is two things. One, we want to define the methodology for measurement. And two, we want to create the technical artifacts that allow for engineers to integrate this methodology into their development lifecycle. So for us, when we see what's happening in the world today, the ability to measure risk is a big barrier to adoption. And that ability to understand and estimate the uncertainty around the behavior of an AI system is something where we think benchmarking can help. So I will actually, because we have a large panel, so I'm going to let everyone else have a chance to talk, and I'm sure more will come out in our dialogue.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. My name is Etienne Chaponia. I work for Qualcomm. I'm a vice president of technical standards. And so what we do within that role is effectively we have team going to technical standards for AI, and we actually try to coordinate where is it that we need to go, how is it that we need to make sure that we understand what it means to be compliant. I come from a world of telecom, as Qualcomm can evoke to some folks. And for us, it's a very different thing, right? For the telecom world, you cannot ship a product unless you comply to a standard, because you need it for interoperability. In the world of AI standards, it's a bit different, so we're talking more about safety standards, and those typically tend to trail the products. The products are out there, and then they're going to comply to standards at some point when the standards are available. What matters, however, what is common in all of this is that the standards need to be available at scale for everyone, and in a way that engineering teams can do it easily, at least from the product side. So I think I'll leave it at that and pass it on.
Hi everyone, I'm Wan Si from Singapore government. I work in AI governance and policy. So many things, but specifically for standards, what it means to us is setting norms. That means alignment globally on what good looks like. And specifically in the area of AI governance, then a lot of it has to do at this stage in terms of common methodologies and processes that we have to follow. But it's still technical, it's not a checkbox, but hopefully that helps us all align to what good looks like. Thanks.
And maybe before the next introductions, just so you can get a flavor, we have standard setters and measurers. We have people in industry, and we have people who play in the policy and the regulatory environment. And that's the importance around this topic.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda from Microsoft. I lead the public policy team within the Office of Responsible AI at Microsoft. I think Wansi said it well when she described standards as really like aligning around what good looks like. And I would offer, we actually at Microsoft in our office, we define something called our responsible AI standard that applies to all of our internal kind of product groups, our engineering function, our sales function. And if you think about like the role of that internal standard is to align all of the internal stakeholders we have around what good looks like. Externally, we need the same sort of mechanism, right? And that's the role that standards can play in the broader ecosystem. So we want to partner with our industry colleagues, and we want to partner with governments and others around the world to be able to define what good looks like, so we can all have that common language and set of expectations.
Hello, Jocelyn, Google DeepMind, where I also work on issues of AI standards, governance, and policy. Building on what's been said, so I think that was an interesting point that often technical standards come first and process and safety standards often come later. In the space of AI at the moment, actually regulation has gone ahead and jumped to, we've regulated and essentially made reference to standards that do not yet exist. So for places like Google DeepMind, who have not invested heavily in the standard space in the past, this is now of an utmost priority because we actually need this to assist with implementation and compliance. That is a primary goal on our side.
I'm Chris Meserole. I'm the Executive Director of the Frontier Model Forum. Our mission is to advance frontier AI safety and security, and we work with many of the leading frontier AI developers and deployers, including several colleagues on the stage today, to advance best practices for risk management. For frontier AI in particular, there's a kind of a set of unique and novel risks that over the last couple of years, the community has really started to develop and converge around a set of best practices that now I think need to start to graduate into actual formal standards, and I think that's kind of why we're here. That's why we're very interested in the standard setting space.
Hi everyone, my name is Esther Tetrashvili and I'm the AI standards lead at OpenAI. Echoing many of the things that have already been said, I think standards for us, especially as a frontier AI lab, is about translating some of our practices for risk management into the language of risk management for customers across the supply chain, and it's also about creating a language for consumer trust and assurance. It's also about, in the age of agents, thinking about interoperability and helping everyone benefit from this ecosystem that we're developing here. So I'm really excited to be here and to talk about these issues with you all.
Thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Kshitij Bhatla from Bureau of Indian Standards, the national standards body of India, and here representing ISO IC JTC 1 SC42, because BIS, Bureau of Indian Standards, is a part of the SC42. And for us, I would say standards are the tools which enables consumers trust in the whatever ecosystem for which they are developed, as well as enablers for the industry to get it done, to ensure the quality and the consumer trust. I would say that's the main focus areas for us. Yep. Thank you.
So let's start with why we need standards. Why are we even here? Because there's a lot of confusion between standards, regulation, legislation. Are we going to get global cooperation around these things? Maybe should it just from a standard setting perspective, and then maybe from a regulatory perspective. Why are we here? What are we? What's the problem we're solving, and for whom?
So I would say the problems, there are multiples in the standards domain. Specifically, it's always starts with what we are tackling with. What is AI? That was the primary focus of the JTC1 SC42 when it started. So it defined what is AI, what is generative AI now they're talking about, what is agentic AI as of now talking about. So I think the most of the specific points that needs to be tackled care is what is coming next and to keep pace with that. And apart from once it comes to that, when we have kind of mentioned that what it is all about, then how do we verify and validate whatever is being said that this is a system which is having AI. For example, I would say someone says they have then equipment, call it washing machine or refrigerators, is equipped with the AI. But is it actually equipped with the AI, right, or it's just a normal logic system? So this is something that we're trying to do the standardization.
Right. So it's about trust. It's about verifying. The tech firms here represented are moving very fast with the model development. So it's like we need standards there. Just from a regulatory perspective, what would you add there?
I wouldn't say from a regulatory perspective. Maybe in terms of why, from an AI policy perspective, you think standards are helpful. It's, like I said, it's about defining alignment in what should be in, let's say, transparency, right? So I think if you say what would be the top 3 things today that we want to think about testing, setting for standards will be one, testing. How do you do testing for AI? Whether it's AI models or AI applications, I think that's one area, because then it defines what good testing can look like, right? Two, perhaps in transparency, what would disclosure look like, right? Everyone is sort of have their own way of sharing the information that they want to share. One way is to standardize it so it's easier for the readers, people who are consuming this information to understand. And I'm saying this in very, very broad terms. I mean, it depends on which reader you're talking about, who's going to consume, but just in broad terms, perhaps one way of standardizing it. Maybe the third way could be in how you're reporting or monitoring incidents. But we're still very, very early days. But that's where standards, again, in terms of alignment, that might be one. It will be useful to find some alignment in these areas.
Right. So how do we report? How do we disclose? How do we make it credible? And so it's not a subjective tick-the-box exercise, etc. From a standard-setting, Chris and Rebecca, from a standard-setting perspective, what would you add to that before we have kind of the industry view?
I'm happy to add to this. So I think there's been a theme that has come across in this panel a couple of times, which is what is good enough. And I think in order to define that, a standard represents a consensus about what is good enough. The problem that we have is who contributes to that consensus. It shouldn't probably be exclusively an industry perspective. You need to have more stakeholders. There are more constituencies that need to be represented in that definition. And then on top of that, what is good enough, as I think Jocelyn mentioned earlier when we were talking before this panel, there's a scientific element to that. How do you define the characteristics of a system such that you can actually create the kind of uncertainty estimation that lives up to a statistical guarantee? But then there's also the political element to that, which represents a whole set of issues that I'm actually not qualified to talk about. So I will pass it to Chris.
Is Chris's mic working?
Sorry. I was just saying, one of the things we should maybe do is back up a little bit to this question of what are standards for. And I think a big part of what standards are for is to try and solve this collective action problem of there's a kind of unique set of risks that we are worried about. We want to make sure everyone's on the same page so that no one kind of actor is disadvantaged or advantaged compared to others. Having standards for how we're going to manage risks across an ecosystem are extremely useful for that. So there's a policy dimension to it. There's also an adoption dimension to it, right? Because people want to know that there's kind of a common way across industry of handling a certain class of risk. And I think being able to set standards and have a formal standard setting body, to one of the points that was made earlier, they are, by definition, a standard setting body is open, right? So there's a legitimacy and a credibility to standard setting bodies that you don't have if it's just industry or just government in many cases. And I think all of those kind of factors coming together are exactly why we're so keen on kind of pushing forward the standards discussions around risk management for AI.
Yep. So maybe from a hyperscaler perspective, maybe Esther, then Jocelyn, and we can kind of like play the different. How is this showing up kind of at your firms, and how are you thinking about this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think from sort of a market adoption perspective, a lot of our technology, like general purpose AI models or foundation models, are being integrated into existing ecosystems or on top of stacks. And there's a lot of confusion in terms of risk controls and risk management about what that means. We have our own risk management processes, they have their own risk management processes, and one of the barriers to adoption is having a common language to talk about how do you map those controls onto one another. There's a separate challenge, I think, of like who is best positioned to control a particular risk. What are the risks? What are the net new risks? What are the risks that are already existing where we don't need to create something net new? And so for us, it's both an imperative in some ways to kind of translate what we're doing in terms of managing risks into the language of upstream, downstream customers so that they can understand and map those same practices onto their controls. And then we kind of can create a universal language that can ease trust and assurance in an easy, grokkable way across the market. There's also just space for, I think several people have talked about regulations moving ahead of the standards, where we are still developing methodologies. What is standardizable in what we're doing, recognizing where the science is not caught up yet, and where we maybe are in a place of more maturity.
And maybe just to bring it to life for the audience, given the huge amount of subscribers you have in India, around the world, growing every day, what's changed in the standard vernacular at OpenAI?
in terms of our adoption or in terms of how we're just translating
the prominence of it, how people are thinking about it, the importance of the topic.
So I think there's both an aspect of it that's like, what does already exist that we can use that can reassure customers that we are following the best practices for the industry, say for privacy or cybersecurity. There's an existing risk management standard, ISO 42001, that OpenAI just got certified in. That definitely signals something to the market and to customers. Then there's also sort of a transparency element, right? We have our safety frameworks, we update them, we disclose information about, in our model cards, performance on a variety of metrics. And then there's certain things we do to kind of elevate and help stakeholders across the spectrum in terms of how to build evaluations. So we currently published a safety hub that gets updated regularly that kind of tells how we're performing in a variety of metrics and what are the best methodologies and how to work with us.
Great. So Jocelyn, can you bring to life how Google DeepMinds are thinking about standard setting in that context?
Yes, I'll take it back to what Chris was talking about in terms of collective action problems. So some of the mitigations that we're talking about associated with some of the more extreme risks that frontier AI poses can be quite costly. And so I do think that there is just a strong industry incentive to work together to resolve this collective action problem. Again, as Chris said, doing this through standards, through an open, legitimate process seems to be incredibly impactful. Again, like, the worst thing for adoption would be a safety incident. So again, we have a collective incentive as an industry to make sure that we raise the floor to avoid that on all of our behalfs. So I do think that that is seen, I think standards at this point are seen as a very clear and important strategic play for making, essentially clearing the path for rapid adoption.
And Amanda, how do they show up at Microsoft right now?
So
Couldn't hear the question.
How do these standards show up at Microsoft? Amanda's going to speak about Microsoft's experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to start by just thinking about at Microsoft, at Google, at other places. It's not a totally new kind of process that we're going through, right? In terms of thinking about standards and the importance of standards for adoption of this technology, sufficient trust in order to have adoption, and in order to really enable compliance. I mean, I think Esther made a really good point and sort of acknowledging that, especially as we are deploying this technology, we are working with customers that have their own set of standards and regulation. And part of the challenge that we find ourselves facing right now in AI governance is we have a lot of high-level norms and expectations that, again, are not so different from the patterns we've seen before. Basically, we want to know how AI providers are managing risk. But we are in the early days of defining really what that means in practice in a really detailed way, especially across the AI value chain. So what are model developers really responsible for doing for risk management? What are application developers really responsible for doing? How does that dock into what deployers of those applications that are oftentimes implementing existing standards and meeting existing regulatory requirements, how does all of that fit together? And again, we've done this with other digital technologies as well, like software, like cloud services, where we're ultimately trying to define in practice what is everyone responsible for doing, how do we have a common language to be able to talk to each other among sort of providers or the supply chain of technology and those that are ultimately deploying it. But we actually really do need the standards to support that, right? Because otherwise we are stuck at the sort of high level conversation about norms around, we want to evaluate risks. We want to figure out what the kind of right transparency practices are. Or we can find ourselves in this sort of deep technical weeds, but sort of having a place in between that is really at the level of standards, of technical standards, really helps drive that kind of common set of expectations so that you can have trusted adoption, and then also you can have clarity for compliance.
Yeah. So we need them, they're important, we've got to drive adoption, there's a collective action agreement here. From a Qualcomm perspective, Etienne, bring to life the business model, how you use this in engineering your products.
Yeah, so I think there's one thing that I'd like to note here. As Qualcomm, we're basically provide chipsets, right? We're not building big models. What matters to us still, the fact and the reason why we're engaged in those standards, whether it's in ISO, Sentinel for Europe, ML Commons when it's other type of standards, is effectively the fact that it provides scale in the sense of providing scale not only across the globe, but also allows any different type of companies to benefit from it. I mean, let's be clear, right? If you look at the companies who have the type of resources to either set up their own standards and risk management systems internally, they are typically pretty big companies. Now, the thing with AI is that there's a huge amount of companies who are being created every day, and they don't have the resources to put this together. And so there's two conditions for making sure that the type of standards that are being put together are, one, inclusive, is that they're open, as Rebecca, you were alluding to before. And so whether it's ML Commons, which is a very open governance model, or ISO or Sentinelec in Europe, there needs to be an opportunity for everyone to participate, right? So that's the first step. However, we know, and that's the reality, that not everyone has the means to participate because they're like super focused. They need to bring up their own LLM for that particular use case or maybe very general use case, and they just don't have the resources to do this. So from that standpoint, having the standard as effectively a mechanism for them to go directly to product and know that they're going to comply with what the effectively world or the community has set up is really important. So from Qualcomm, the reason why we want to participate is to enable this type of accessibility to companies which are not always the biggest one.
Yep. So agreement that we need them. Before we go into how we set standards, how we measure and benchmark them, and Rebecca will bring that to life, a wildcard question is, there could be a lot of people listening to this to say, the world is not connected and cooperating around this. We don't have global regulations on AI, but yet we have industry leaders, standard setters, vehemently agreeing. How should the audience think about that? Is there a disconnect there, or would anyone like to comment on that?
I would actually so part of one of the reasons why I think we're also interested in standards is one of the things you're seeing is multiple jurisdictions saying some version of, we think that there are new risks with frontier AI. We as the government are concerned on behalf of our citizens that we are kind of attending to those risks across industry. Those risks and how to manage those risks are probably best left to be developed or kind of managed through the standard setting process, but they aren't always setting the standards, right? So in the United States, there's a couple of different states, for example, within the United States that have passed requirements for frontier AI developers to have a frontier AI framework, but they don't specify what should actually be in the framework. They kind of offload some of that to the standards process, which is why I think it's so important to have these standards in place. Like there's a clear kind of policy and regulatory interest in there being mechanisms by which some of the risks that may come with frontier AI are managed, but that we need to kind of color in the lines a little bit exactly like how we're all going to do this as a community.
Yeah. And before we go to Rebecca, just from an India perspective, PM Modi ji talked about Manav yesterday and the AI vision. Through there was a lot of focus on validity and governance, so standards were implied there. Do you want to just bring to life kind of how India thinks about this before we go to Rebecca and talk about measurement?
So I would say the Manav mission, its welfare, human-centric, and all those aspects are there. And from the governance perspective also, what is going on is that as of now, the India AI governance guidelines are there, which is providing you a framework that these are the things that you should look into, just providing a reference to. So in this direction, the Indian government as of now is moving into, from the perspective of standardization and at the national level as well as the ISO level. I'm adding to the question that you asked previously, that standards bodies are interconnected with each other. The ISO, there is a license mechanisms, we have the ML Commons as the license there, the IEEEs are there, all bodies are there. So they are all interconnected there, and then whatever is coming out of these bodies is an outcome which is based on the studies and done by various forums. It's not only the one, I would say, just the ISO body or not. So in this direction, the Indian standards that we are working on, we are developing, are also in the direction, because AI is something which is global. We can't have sense specifically for India. There could be the risks, there could be specific use cases that are India specific. For those we need to have some specific guidance, but more or less everything is the global thing that we are trying to look into and then adapt those with the specific use cases that we need to know.
Right, so we need global, we need to adapt that to kind of local kind of conditions and use cases. So let's get a bit more technical, Rebecca. Like, why is this hard? How do we measure it? Like, how does it compare to benchmarking? Maybe Rebecca, and then from a regulatory perspective. Did you want to sort of make a quick comment? Yes, do you want to make a response there, and then we'll get into
Sorry,
that?
Rebecca.
Please.
No, I just want to respond to Chris' comment and your question about, if there's no regulations, then why do we care about standards, right? I mean, sure, I think there will be regulators who will say, yes, you turn to the technical standards to define the expectations, which I think is the fair point that Chris made. But even when there's no regulations, I think the standards still are useful. I mean, Esther just mentioned that OpenAI is certified for 42001. You didn't need to do that, but why did you do it, right? And Anthropic has done that as well. And I think the idea is that perhaps there's also a way to differentiate for organizations, for enterprises. And it doesn't have to be the frontier model labs only. It could be app developers and so on. The way to differentiate themselves and say that, look, I'm adhering to a global standard. I'm demonstrating that I have actually implemented something that's good enough. I've addressed a risk in this way. I think that's one good reason for standards, even if there's no regulatory cover. So the certification, the assurance part is helpful. Yeah, I just wanted to add that as a little bit of color, just to give some benefits to the standards community that you're still kind of very relevant.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bringing the regulatory perspective and kind of the Singapore experience. So let's get into measure. And the fellow panelists, if you want to respond to anything, just give me the signal. We're going to make this an interactive conversation. So Rebecca, how do we measure this?
Well, solve all the problems in one definition. No, I'm kidding. But as I said earlier, benchmarking consists of two things. It consists of a methodology, at least from our perspective, the way that we do benchmarking consists of a measurement methodology, and it consists of reference builds, implementations of that methodology so that engineers can use that. And the definition of a benchmark, as we've been trying to operationalize this in places like ISO and others, is a taxonomy, a data set, and an evaluator system. And the point of all of that construct is, as Etienne pointed out, this allows for you to scale this kind of approach towards the type of deployments that we're expecting to see in these types of AI settings. The challenge behind all of this is that what you're really trying to do is estimate uncertainty. You're trying to provide a sense of, I'm not going to tell you that your system is quote unquote safe or not. What I'm going to tell you is under these considerations, under these conditions, under these assumptions, the estimated likelihood of a particular risky behavior is X. And then it is up to you as a risk management professional, a deployer, a developer, it's up for you to decide, is that enough? Is that good enough for your needs? And I don't think it's going to be the same for different sectors. I think some sectors will have a much higher bar for the amount of uncertainty that needs to be estimated, and then other sectors will probably be like, that's good enough for me. I don't necessarily need to get much further than what you are offering right off the date. So we can go into all of the different questions that remain open, but those particular areas related to developing that taxonomy, developing those data sets, and developing those evaluators, the best practices and the standards to make it clear that this is the best in the industry, this is the way that it is, that's what we need to get better at.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is we need clarity of the taxonomy, clarity of what we're measuring, and it needs to be verifiable and credible. From an industry perspective, would anyone like to pick up, like, how's that going to work? What's in place now? What some of the challenges might be? How do you get organizational buy-in? Anything to add from an industry manager? You want to start us off?
Sure. I mean, I think there's work to do across all the elements that Rebecca just laid out, and it's really a reason why we are really invested in working with ML Commons, because I think we need places that are bringing industry and civil society and stakeholders together to actually work through these problems and resolve these hard questions in ways that are really going to be sort of valid and reliable broadly. And so I think that's really the work still ahead, but I think we are also making good progress, right? And thanks to ML Commons for helping to facilitate that.
Yep.
My thought on this is that we've been talking for years now about how nascent this field is, and that actually to judge if we are actually making progress, this too could be standardized, right? Like, we don't have common ways of assessing, are we still in a nascent stage, what levels of uncertainty do we have? So to Rebecca's point, I think this is absolutely essential so we can all align exactly on, have we made sufficient progress to start relying on these things? To what degree can we rely on them for important decision making around deployments?
Yeah, I think I'll just add, if we take this back down to like the basics, I think whether you're an enterprise customer or you're a consumer of our products, you just want to know, like, is this thing going to be accurate? Can I rely on this thing? Is this going to get me into trouble? If I incorporate this in my workflows, am I going to carry some sort of liability? And at the core of standards is figuring out a way to have a common mechanism to provide an answer of reassurance. You can trust us. Here's a measurement certified by somebody else of that this thing is reliable, that this thing is accurate, that I can rely on this thing and I can use this thing. And I think we're in this moment where we're still trying to figure out as an industry and as a community about what that's going to look like. And so whether it's advancing the measurement science, right, because we currently don't have enough of that in order to make sure that we can give an estimate of what is accurate, what is reliable, what is safe for specific risks, or on the other side, what are the risks that we care about? I think some risks might be, some countries, some jurisdictions might have one list of risks, other countries might have a different list of risks. And then there's going to be a question of like, how do you control for that, right? And that's kind of what Rebecca and ML Commons and many others are working on, is how do you provide some sort of mechanism of credibility that says we've measured this thing is safe, that can then be certified, could be understood in the same way for everyone. So at the end of the day, in order for us to really unlock the value of this new technology that is transformative, I think many of us who are here today for the Indian Impact Summit recognize that potential. We all also need to kind of answer those questions, and standards are the way you facilitate it.
Yeah, and so there's a theme of trust that's going through this. So maybe Chris, add to that, and then at the end to comment from a Qualcomm perspective.
Yeah, just briefly, I think I also just want to situate how kind of benchmarking standards and some of the scientific questions we've been talking about fit in. Like I think we've been talking a lot about different types of standards. I just want to clarify that there's like a kind of broader, high-level set of process standards where you kind of say, all right, for this class of risk, what we're going to do is we're going to identify what the risk is. We're then going to evaluate what that risk might actually be, and then we're going to put in place certain kinds of mitigations and controls. Those are kind of, it's a process for how you're going to walk through risk management for something. That absolutely needs to be standardized. But then even within that, once we get to, all right, once we have agreed on what the risk is that we're trying to evaluate, how do we actually do that? And that's where the standards come in for the benchmarks that we want to see developed. And that's where some of these scientific questions, I think, really come into play, because we need to have, those kind of credible scientific evaluations and tests for the whole kind of broader risk management effort to hang together.
Yep.
And it's, again, critical, I think, for this whole process.
Yes, this has got to live next to the risk management, identification, mitigation strategy in any company. Go ahead, Jocelyn.
I just add briefly, I think the possibility for comparison across models is also something that's super important here. I think there's an important safety dimension there. If we actually are all measuring the same thing and can give consumers some relative assessment of safety, of quality, this is actually going to potentially contribute to a race to the top as opposed to the bottom.
Yep. And so that's the question on who we're solving for. Two of the panelists have mentioned consumers. It's not just about enterprise, it's not just about governments, it's all about consumer trust. Etienne, what would you add?
What I wanted to add is the fact that here, when we're talking in general, about trying to create standard to resolve the type of safety risk that we're going to see, it's just also to reassure the audience that it's not that we're trying to solve every single risk that happen. There is a huge amount of existing standard bodies, whether it's in ISO and Sentinelec and in other places, where they already have identified risks for their particular verticals or their particular, not silos, but their particular industries. Those are already at work, right? So how they're going to use AI, how the AI is going to be effectively, the AI safety is going to be translated to their own processes. Those things are already happening, right? So it's not only the people on this panel who are working on this, the entire community of standards, whether it's in automotive, radio equipment directive, everything is already, everybody's already looking at that, right? In the end, the difficult part is going to be to make sure that there's a commonality in terms of the type of techniques that we're using whenever there's an automated technique that we can use. Because from an industry standpoint, what is really useful, in particular if you're a smaller company, is to make sure that you can run something efficiently and it addresses as much as the use cases that you run as possible. So that is an important thing that we need to keep in mind when we're doing this. So it's why, I mean, from Qualcomm, obviously we don't address every single thing, but we want to make sure that at least in the areas where we're involved, there's going to be as much as a commonality in terms of the measurement techniques that we're going to use.
So consensus around the need to do it, consensus in the fact that it's hard, but it's important for consumers and business and investors. But Jocelyn made a point that we've been talking about how this is a nascent topic, etc. I want to look forward. What over the next 2 years does this look like? What have we got to get right? The models are changing. You know, there could be regulation that changes. There could be changes around, you know, China, US operating in different ways. What does this topic look like? How do we make sure we stay the course on this topic? Anyone want to offer a perspective as we look forward? And then we'll start wrapping up and thinking about questions, and we can get questions from the audience.
I'll take a crack at it. At least from my perspective, there are a couple of things that I hope to see over the next couple of years. One is that I think this idea of benchmarks and other standards representing consensus, we should be seeing more things like certification that represent more types of consensus. If benchmarking represents consensus around how to estimate and measure a thing, certification could end up representing an agreement. A definition of like what is good enough deserves some form of certification. I don't know necessarily what that's going to look like today, but I have to imagine that those sort of represent truces, the temporary of agreements about this is good enough for my industry, this is good enough for my deployment, this is good enough for my use case. So that's what I'm hoping we start to see over the next 2 years.
Anyone else want to add to that? Because, I mean, Chris, jump in, but we've seen some of these disclosures in the past, and people commit to environmental goals or DEI goals or other set of standards or disclosures. Stakeholder capitalism was a big deal, and now it's more about shareholders. So I'd love to understand, like, our perspective on, like, how do we stay the course?
Yeah, I might distinguish a little bit between how do we future-proof these standards and then how do we kind of ensure that they're implemented over time. And I think the way that we future-proof them is to some extent to go back to the point I was making earlier about process standards, right? The process is somewhat agnostic to the actual kind of, you know, AI system itself and the capabilities it has. If you have a good process for identifying risks, evaluating risks, that process can kind of be a bit future-proofed. The specific evals you run are probably going to have to be updated over time to account for the greater capabilities of models as they advance, right? And I think similar with some of the controls that might need to be kind of used to manage some of the risks, if there's certain thresholds or kind of if their evaluations kind of indicate a certain level of risk, right? So the subcomponents of it might need to be evaluated. The overarching framework hopefully can kind of have some legs behind it over time, right, in terms of future-proofing it.
So we must commit to a process. We can't future-proof because we can't predict the future, but the process is so important.
Even a good example of this would be something like the, I think 40001 has come up a few times. Like there's a certain class of AI that 40001 is very kind of tailored to, but even that AI has changed over time. But 40001 is still a very good kind of standard for managing those kinds of risks for those kind of applications of AI across a broad array of machine learning algorithms. But the other point that I would make in terms of, you know, you alluded to some of the kind of implementation of standards over time and making sure that they have the same currency to them. And there, I think we can rely on some of the incentives and the need, again, for there to be collective action on this that we've talked about before. Some of the incentive to make sure that there's a collective action problem is going to rest with policymakers, which is why you've seen some, you know, regulatory activity. Even in areas where there's not, to Juan C's point, there's a clear market need for these standards to be developed and implemented over time because consumers want to see, you know, they want to trust that you know, whether it's, you know, individual consumers or enterprise, they want to trust that the model is actually safe and secure to use. And so I don't see kind of the standards, the importance of standards diminishing over time. In fact, if anything, as the capabilities advance, consumers and enterprises are going to be more and more interested in making sure that they know for sure these things are safe.
Yes, it's going to be consumer driven. Wansi, just from a regulatory perspective, any thoughts? Chris mentioned implementation. which is the hard stuff of where lots of this stuff gets stuck. Any perspective on implementation or from your experience as a regulator to add here?
Implementation of standards?
Yes.
I mean, Chris put it very well, right? One, regulators could say, I expect you to comply with certain requirements, and this is how you do it, and that's where the standards set out how you do it. Or regulators don't provide certain requirements or certain expectations, and the market sets out these requirements and these expectations. This is how if you do it, then we will buy your product, for example. So I think from an implementation point of view, there's sufficient. I think there will be some momentum either from the market or from regulations to move standards. But I hope, back to your original question, what's going to happen in 2 years, I hope we can actually move faster on standards in terms of the definitions of standards. I think that would be super useful. We're leading some work on testing, benchmarking and red teaming, primarily methodology definition, but we hope that in the next 1 year that can be done and sorted and accepted within the ISO process. But the experience has shown us that it takes a while, right? So in the next few years, hopefully we find a way in which we can move to standards faster.
So we need to move with speed from a regulatory perspective. Amanda's going to have the last word, and then we're going to go to questions, so please prepare them. Amanda?
I didn't realize that. No, the one thing I wanted to add in terms of a goal for where we can find ourselves 2 years from now is thinking about like a system of standards that are interoperable, where we have a sort of modular approach, right? Where across like general purpose technology and, for example, in different sort of deployment scenarios, different use cases, different sectors, we actually can get some efficiency from, these standards are all going to need to continuously evolve and improve, and we're going to learn from the science, and we're going to keep evolving the benchmarks and the kind of methodology around the evaluations. But we don't want to like keep starting from scratch with every piece of that puzzle, and so we need to figure out a way to actually ensure that like where we are making progress on the evaluation science and how we are doing this in the context of like evaluating AI models or systems, and then how we are evaluating AI and deployment in like critical sectors, for example. We actually have some synergy built into the standards ecosystem so that we are making kind of more dynamic progress across everything at the same time.
Yeah, so it needs to be interoperable, and we can't keep reinventing the wheel. So audience questions, I'm going to collect questions, maybe 3 to 5. So the gentleman at the front, the gentleman at the back, and then the lady with her hand up.
Hi there, thanks for taking my question. Maybe I have a bit of a tricky question for you. On the panel, obviously, we have a lot of commercial interests. My question is this: how do we know, in your assurance program or whatever you're proposing, that it's going to be done, since it's driven primarily by industry? How do we know that you're not just going to create something that cheaply satisfies the industry in front of us versus what the public actually needs? And assuming you do have a program that you're going to talk about, how does a government or external agency audit such a program, given the skill gap to create such a very sophisticated compliance program? How can world governments come? Because I've been on a lot of panels this week. The fear, uncertainty, and doubt is not only just the policy gap, it's actually the technical gap, the inability of world governments to audit properly whatever you have.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So keep the questions brief. Thank you for that. So that's about like how do we make it real? How do we make it not performative? I'm going to collect 2 other questions, and then we'll throw them to the panelists. So keep your hands raised, whoever, gentleman at the back, and I think there was a lady, or a gentleman with a tie.
Yeah, hi. So as a recent computer science student, I'm interested in building AI for India. Specifically with such a distinguished panel, I thought I'd shoot my shot. I'm a little nervous, so I apologize about that. I want to talk specifically about language bias. Being in India, there are 22 official languages, and I'm constantly thinking in 2 to 3 different languages. And when I utilize tools, such amazing tools built by everybody here, I'm wondering how you guys would go about tackling language bias and building guardrails around that to ensure that a small model like a student like me is making does not go haywire.
Yeah, great question about language. Thank you, sir. And then gentleman with a tie, which doesn't mean like more gentlemen wear ties, but yes, please.
Hi, Jules Polonetsky at the Future of Privacy Forum and our AI Governance Center. The standards always seem to be an easier path when they are more technical than challenging social policy, and AI governance seems to capture the most broad potential collections of social policy. And given that there's a lot of disagreement and some debate over whether one should even measure certain areas, do you imagine that we're talking about minimum viable consensus with the broadest number of stakeholders, or is there a path to in some way address some issues that some stakeholders see as absolutely necessary and others don't want on the table?
Yep. All right, soundbite responses panel. Like, how do we make it real? How do we deal with the skills gap? How do we deal with the MVP? Anyone? Go on, Jocelyn.
On the performative question, I think now that standards have been referred to within actual regulation, I think to the extent that we want to use these standards as evidence of conformity with those particular regulations, that sets a kind of minimum bar at the very least, because I think if we make these things too high level, too abstract, or too essentially lowest common denominator, I don't think regulators are going to look at those standards as evidence of conformity. So I think there is that kind of interlocking pressure created by the regulation itself for some sort of degree of quality.
Thank you. And Esther, do you want to comment on the language perspective and how you're thinking about that at OpenAI?
Thank you. Yes, we do a series of evaluations like MMLU for determining how well our models perform on a variety of languages. We also have a specific test actually in QA. There's also a specific test in QA that we also kind of test our models on that has a variety of dialects within India, though I think the short answer is that this is an area where we need more participants, and I believe ML Commons is an active, playing an active role in helping further our capacity building. And I think working with local ecosystems to help clean and collect good data so that we can do this appropriately. This is another area, right, just like we've been saying, where we need to work in partnership to figure out how do we both collect the type of information, how do we measure this stuff, how do we build the evaluations, and then how do we build an industry standard where all of the actors are kind of held to that standard. And it's going to have to be a collective effort.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Just to add a little bit on the question regarding the language, in the end, I don't think there's there's no silver bullet solution, right? There's going to be a need to have this type of either safety test or safety prompt, which are required for different type of languages. And you're not going to be able to address every single thing because there's just a huge amount of diversity. I mean, take me. I'm French from cultural background. I speak English and think in French and English all the time. There's weird stuff that I say that will not be captured by a model that's only for American English, right? So there's going to be a need for more than one language which are captured, and probably a lot of them, but this is where the community of basically everybody needs to come and say, hey, this is what I want to capture for my type of language. What matters to make sure that there is scale and that it still remains efficient is that hopefully the tool and the software framework around it can be reused. And that's really a big advantage for that. Thank you.
So in summary, and thank you, dear panelists, for the great discussion. So you heard today that standards are important. This is a fast-moving world. We've got to be designing for consumers, for business people. There's a commitment here around measurement. It's both art and science. We need to have the process that's consistent. But across regulators, across standard setters, around policymakers, and the business and the tech community, there's a consistent understanding. So it's going to be an emerging topic, which I know we'll continue to discuss. Thank you, panelists, and thank you to the audience. Thank you. Thank you.
Please take a photo with the phone.
Oh. इधर आके